May 17, 1943, 12:28 a.m. 60 feet above the Ruhr Dam reservoir, Wing Commander Guy Gibson held his Lancaster bomber steady at exactly 232 miles per hour. The spotlights beneath his aircraft formed a perfect figure 8 on the black water, the signal they were at precise attack height. Behind him, Gunner Flight Sergeant George Deering watched a cylindrical object drop from the bomb bay, hit the water, and do something no bomb had ever done before. It bounced once, twice, 3 times, 4 times across the surface like a skipping stone, then disappeared against the dam wall. 60 seconds later, a column of water erupted 800 feet into the air, and 134 million gallons of water began pouring through a 250-foot gap in what the Germans had declared an indestructible fortress. The Ruhr Dam supplied water to 5 million people and powered the factories producing 60% of Germany's steel. Its destruction in a single night would seem impossible, except that a 56-year-old aviation engineer with no military training had spent 3 years solving a problem the Royal Air Force had declared unsolvable. Before we continue with Barnes Wallis's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Barnes Wallis's workshop in Effingham, Surrey, where a seemingly impossible idea was about to change the course of the war. Barnes Neville Wallis was born in 1887 in Ripley, Derbyshire, the son of a doctor who couldn't afford to send him to university. At 17, he became an apprentice marine engineer at J. Samuel White's shipyard on the Isle of Wight, spending his evenings studying mathematics and engineering by candlelight in his boarding house room. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, wore thick round spectacles, and spoke with a slight stammer when excited about technical problems. His colleagues remembered him pacing his workshop at 2 a.m., muttering calculations, surviving on tea and biscuits for days when working on a difficult equation. By 1930, Wallis had designed the R-100 airship and pioneered the geodetic airframe construction that made the Wellington bomber possible. He was respected but not particularly well known, a backroom engineer who solved problems other men declared impossible. His workshop at Vickers Armstrong in Weybridge was cluttered with models, slide rules, and notebooks filled with mathematical formulas written in meticulous handwriting. He rode his bicycle to work every morning at 6:45 a.m., arriving before anyone else, his mind already working on whatever challenge occupied him that week. In the autumn of 1940, while London burned under the Luftwaffe's bombardment, Wallis became obsessed with a strategic problem that kept him awake at night. Germany's industrial capacity depended on hydroelectric power and water transportation. The Ruhr Valley dams, the Möhne, Eder and Sorpe, provided both. The Möhne alone held 140 million cubic meters of water behind a concrete wall 40 meters thick at its base and 112 meters tall. German engineers had designed it to withstand any conventional attack. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the reservoir. Torpedo nets hung in the water. The Luftwaffe would never allow a bomber to approach at the low altitude needed for accurate bombing. Every engineer Wallis consulted told him the same thing. Attacking the dams was suicide. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A standard bomb dropped from 20,000 feet would scatter across a wide area with only a tiny probability of hitting the narrow dam wall. Even if it hit, the explosion would dissipate in the air and water, causing minimal damage to the massive concrete structure, and getting close enough for accuracy meant flying at 100 feet or less, well within range of the 88mm flak guns that had already torn apart 14 British bombers attempting low-level strikes in the Ruhr Valley between August and November 1940. Wallis began calculating. At his kitchen table each evening, surrounded by his wife Molly and their 4 children, he filled notebook after notebook with force calculations, water compression formulas, and structural stress equations. His daughter Mary, then 12 years old, remembered him building small models from soap and dropping them into the bathtub, timing their descent with his pocket watch. His neighbors complained about the noise of his backyard experiments, metal spheres dropped into a water tank from increasingly greater heights, each impact recorded in another notebook. The breakthrough came on a November evening in 1940. Wallis was reading a paper by a German engineer about wave mechanics when he noticed something others had missed. Water is incompressible. When an explosion occurs underwater against a solid structure, the shock wave doesn't dissipate, it concentrates. A 6,000-pound bomb exploding in contact with the dam wall underwater would create a shock wave with the focused power of a much larger weapon. The water itself would become the delivery mechanism for concentrated force that could crack even the Murners' massive concrete structure. But that created a new problem. How do you get a bomb to the exact position, underwater against the dam wall, from a bomber that couldn't fly lower than 60 feet without hitting the reservoir surface or getting shredded by flak guns? Between November 1940 and May 1941, Wallis tested 47 different approaches. He tried bombs with parachutes that would descend slowly to the correct depth. The parachutes tangled. He designed bombs with weighted noses that would dive at precise angles. They tumbled. He created bombs with buoyancy chambers that would float down underwater. They moved too slowly and drifted off course. Every solution created new problems. His assistant, 31-year-old engineer Michael Summers from Leeds, drowned in a testing accident on March 8, 1941. Summers had been positioning measurement equipment near the impact zone when a 400-pound test sphere broke free from its release mechanism early, hitting the water tank wall and creating a shock wave that knocked him unconscious. By the time workers pulled him out, 7 minutes had passed. Summers had talked constantly about returning to Leeds after the war to teach engineering at the technical college where he'd studied. He'd shown Wallis photographs of his fiancée, Helen, and the house they planned to buy on Woodhouse Street. Summers died before reaching the hospital. Wallis attended the funeral in Leeds. Helen, wearing black, wouldn't look at him. Summers's parents asked no questions. The work was classified. They couldn't be told their son had drowned testing equipment for a weapon that might never exist. Wallis rode the train back to Surrey in silence, staring out the window. In his notebook that night, he wrote only, "M. Summers, March 8th, review all safety protocols, continue work." The solution came from an unlikely source. In April 1941, Wallis was walking beside the Thames with his daughter Mary, watching her skip stones across the water surface. She managed 7 bounces with a flat piece of slate before it sank. Wallis stood perfectly still for nearly a minute, watching the ripples dissipate. Then he turned and walked home so quickly that Mary had to run to keep up. That night, he calculated the physics of a skipping stone on a much larger scale. A cylindrical bomb, rotating backward at exactly 500 revolutions per minute, dropped from precisely 60 feet at precisely 232 miles per hour, would skip across the water surface. The backspin would keep it moving forward with each bounce, losing minimal energy. When it reached the dam wall, the rotation would drag it downward against the concrete face, where it would sink to the optimal depth, approximately 30 feet, before a hydrostatic pressure fuse triggered the explosion. It was elegant. It was simple. It violated every principle of conventional bombing, and Wallis had no proof it would work at full scale. He needed to test it, but the government had already rejected 3 of his proposals for specialized weapons, calling them fanciful and impractical. His reputation at Vickers was suffering. The company wanted him focused on improving the Wellington bomber, not chasing theories about bouncing bombs. He had no budget, no authorization, and no official support. Wallis decided to build it anyway. In May 1941, working alone in his workshop after normal hours, he began constructing the first prototype. He used a wooden barrel from the Vickers carpentry shop, added lead weights to simulate the mass of explosives, and installed a small electric motor powered by a car battery to create the backspin. The entire device weighed 140 pounds, far less than the 9.0-pound weapon he envisioned, but enough to test the physics. The work was exhausting. Wallis was 54 years old, suffering from chronic back pain that forced him to work hunched over his bench. His hands developed calluses from hand-filing the motor-mounting brackets. The smell of machine oil soaked into his clothes. Molly asked no questions when he came home at midnight, his shirt stained with grease, his eyes red from fatigue. On June 3, 1941, at 6:15 a.m. before other workers arrived, Wallis loaded his prototype into the back of a borrowed truck and drove to the Silvermere Lake near Cobham, Surrey. He'd scouted the location weeks earlier, a private fishing lake where he could work undisturbed. The owner, an elderly man named Hitchens, who'd lost his son at Dunkirk, asked only, "Is this for the war?" When Wallis nodded, Hitchens handed him the gate key and walked away. Wallis built a simple catapult from timber, positioned 60 feet above the water on a makeshift scaffold. The wind was calm. The morning mist still hung over the lake surface. His hands shook slightly as he switched on the electric motor, watching the wooden cylinder begin to spin. The whir of the motor seemed impossibly loud in the silence. He pulled the release cord. The cylinder dropped, hit the water and bounced. Once, twice, 3 times across the lake surface before sinking. Wallis stood motionless, his heart hammering. He'd seen the physics work in his kitchen calculations. He'd run the mathematics 200 times. But watching it happen in reality, seeing the cylinder behave exactly as predicted, was different. He tested it 17 more times that morning, adjusting the rotation speed, the release height, and the cylinder weight. By 11:00 a.m., when he heard voices approaching from the public footpath, he'd confirmed the principle. It worked. A spinning cylinder dropped at the right speed would skip across water, maintaining forward momentum through multiple bounces. Wallis packed his equipment, thanked Hitchens, and drove back to Vickers. At his desk, he wrote a formal proposal, a method for attacking the Axis powers through destruction of their hydroelectric dams. He included 47 pages of calculations, diagrams, and test results. He submitted it through official channels to the Air Ministry and the Ministry of Aircraft Production. The response came 6 weeks later. Proposal rejected. Resources cannot be allocated to experimental weapons of unproven utility. Focus efforts on existing programs. Wallis refused to stop. For the next 14 months, he continued testing in secret. He built larger prototypes, 250 pounds, 500 pounds, 200 pounds. He tested different materials, different rotation speeds, different release mechanisms. He spent his own money, nearly $800, equal to 4 months of his salary, on materials and equipment. His colleagues began calling him Bomb-Happy Wallis, doubting his judgment. What the Air Ministry didn't know was that Wallis had also been sending copies of his proposals directly to military officers he knew from previous projects. One of those officers, Air Vice Marshal Ralph Cochrane, saw potential where others saw madness. Cochrane arranged a private demonstration in February 1943. On a cold morning at Chesil Beach in Dorset, Wallis demonstrated a 2-pound prototype to a group of skeptical RAF officers. The prototype bounced 7 times across the water before striking a wooden target structure, sinking against it and settling at the predicted depth. The senior officers watched in silence. Then Cochrane turned to the group and said, "Gentlemen, I believe this can work. We need to brief the chief." Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, was famous for hating experimental weapons. He preferred maximum tonnage dropped on German cities, simple, proven, effective. But he agreed to view Wallis's data. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Harris challenged every calculation. He questioned the range limitations, the training requirements, the specialized equipment needed. Finally, he asked, "How many dams can you destroy with this weapon?" Wallis answered, "Given perfect conditions, optimal targeting, and adequate bomber crews, potentially 3 major dams in a single night, the Möhne, the Eder, and possibly the Sorpe. That would release approximately 330 million tons of water into the Ruhr Valley, flooding factories, disrupting transportation, and cutting power to perhaps 60% of German heavy industry for months." Harris authorized the operation, but Wallis now faced an impossible deadline. The attack had to happen in May 1943, when reservoir water levels were highest. He had 3 months to design, build, and test a full-scale 900-pound bomb that would work on the first attempt. There would be no second chance. If the attack failed, Hundreds of millions of pounds and the lives of 133 aircrew would be wasted. The weapon Wallis designed was officially designated Upkeep, bureaucratic military language for a device unlike anything that had ever been built. It was a cylinder 60 inches long and 50 inches in diameter, weighing 250 pounds when loaded with 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, the most powerful explosive compound available. The cylinder's outer casing was constructed from welded steel plate 3/8 inch thick. Inside, an electric motor powered by a hydraulic system spun the bomb backward at 500 RPM before release. The entire mechanism had to survive the violent shockwave of hitting water at 230 miles per hour, maintain its rotation through multiple bounces, and function reliably after being stored for weeks in a bomber's unheated bomb bay. Wallis worked 16-hour days at the Vickers facility in Burr Hill, Surrey. His team grew to 27 engineers and machinists, all working under strict security. The workshop windows were painted black. Armed guards controlled access. Workers were forbidden from discussing their assignments even with family members. The smell of cutting oil and welded metal hung permanently in the air. The noise of lathes running 20 hours per day made conversation difficult. The first full-scale test took place on April 29, 1943, at Reculver on the Kent coast. A specially modified Lancaster bomber, its bomb bay doors removed, a hydraulic drive system installed to spin the weapon before release, flew at exactly 60 feet altitude at 232 miles per hour. The Upkeep bomb released at 6:34 p.m. It hit the water and disintegrated immediately. The steel casing cracked. The internal mechanism scattered across 200 yards of ocean. Wallis stood on the beach watching pieces of his weapon wash ashore. He had 18 days until the operation's scheduled date. The failure was in the welding. The steel plates, joined by traditional welding methods, couldn't withstand the impact forces. Wallis needed a different construction approach, something that would allow the casing to flex slightly on impact without cracking. He found the answer in a manufacturing technique used for locomotive boilers. Riveted construction with expansion joints. It was old-fashioned, labor-intensive and dramatically more expensive, but it would work. Vickers machinists worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, hand-riveting each bomb casing. The workshop temperature climbed to 95 degrees from the forge fires needed to heat the rivets. Men worked stripped to the waist, their skin blackened by metal dust. Wallis stayed in the workshop, checking each bomb personally, measuring tolerances with calipers, rejecting any component that varied more than 0.002 inches from specifications. The second full-scale test took place on May 13, 1943, 4 days before the scheduled attack date. The Upkeep bomb bounced perfectly, 7 times across the water surface. It struck the test structure, sank against the wall, settled at 30 feet depth, and the hydrostatic fuse functioned exactly as designed. The explosion created a waterspout 600 feet high. Wallis permitted himself one smile. Then he ordered the team back to work. They had to build 36 operational weapons in 84 hours. The bombs were loaded onto trucks at Burr Hill on May 15th, transported under armed guard to RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, and carefully installed in the modified Lancaster bombers of 617 Squadron. The squadron had been formed specifically for this operation, commanded by 24-year-old Wing Commander Guy Gibson, who'd flown 173 combat missions and earned the Distinguished Service Order twice. His aircrew were volunteers, told only that the operation was highly dangerous and of national importance. They didn't know their target until the final briefing on May 16th. At 9:28 p.m. on May 16, 1943, 19 Lancaster bombers took off from Scampton. Each carried 1 Upkeep bomb, 7 crew members, and enough fuel for the 8-hour round trip to the Ruhr Valley. They flew at 100 feet altitude across the North Sea, low enough to avoid radar, but high enough to clear the wave tops. The aircraft were stripped of defensive armor to carry the weight of the Upkeep weapons. If they encountered German fighters, they would be nearly defenseless. Barnes Wallis remained at Scampton. He stood beside the runway, watching each Lancaster lumber into the air, the huge cylindrical bombs visible in the modified bomb bays. As the last aircraft disappeared into the darkness, He walked to the operations room and waited. The radio transmissions began arriving at 12:39 a.m. on May 17th. Brief coded messages. Goner. The Murner Dam was breached. Dingy. The Eder Dam was destroyed. Nigger. The operation commander's dog's name, meaning all objectives achieved. Of the 19 Lancasters that departed, 8 were destroyed by flak guns and night fighters. 53 aircrew were killed. 3 were captured. The Murner and Eder dams were completely breached. The Sorpe Dam was damaged, but held. The resulting flood released 330 million cubic meters of water into the Ruhr Valley, destroying 11 factories, flooding coal mines, destroying rail lines, and cutting power to German industry for nearly 4 months. An estimated 1,600 people drowned in the immediate flooding, most of them forced laborers from occupied countries housed in work camps in the valley bottom. The military value of the raid remained controversial. Post-war analysis suggested German industry recovered faster than anticipated, within 5 months for most facilities. The electric power was restored through alternative sources within weeks. The strategic impact was significant, but not war-winning. Some historians argued the operation was primarily a morale victory for Britain, demonstrating technical capability and precision targeting. At a time when the bombing campaign was otherwise causing enormous civilian casualties with limited military effect. Wallis received no public recognition for his role. The upkeep weapon remained classified until 1963. Official credit for the operation went to Wing Commander Gibson, who was awarded the Victoria Cross and became a national hero. Wallis was mentioned in a brief technical footnote in Gibson's autobiography, identified only as an engineer at Vickers who provided technical support. After the war, Wallis returned to aircraft design. He pioneered swing-wing aircraft concepts and geodetic construction techniques that influenced aircraft design for decades. He worked at Vickers until 1971, retiring at age 84. His daily routine never changed. Bicycle to the office at 6:45 a.m., work until 6:00 p.m., return home to Effingham, where he tended his garden and played with his grandchildren. He rarely spoke about the dam's raid. When asked directly, he would say only, "I worked on many projects during the war. That was one of them." He kept his notebooks from the development of upkeep locked in a filing cabinet in his study. After his death, his daughter Mary donated them to the Imperial War Museum, where they're now catalogued as reference materials in the aviation section. Wallis died on October 30th, 1979, at age 92, from a heart attack at his home in Effingham. His obituary in the Times mentioned his airship work and his contributions to aircraft design. The dam's raid was referenced in a single sentence. He also contributed to specialized munitions development during the war. The RAF Museum at Hendon maintains a small display on Operation Chastise. It includes one of the original upkeep bombs, recovered from a crashed Lancaster, alongside a photograph of Barnes Wallis at his workshop desk, surrounded by calculations and models. The display plaque reads, "The Bouncing Bomb, an unconventional solution to an impossible problem." In 1982, 3 years after Wallis's death, a historian named John Sweetman gained access to declassified Air Ministry files and reconstructed the full story of Upkeep's development. He interviewed surviving engineers from Wallis's team and pieced together the details of the secret testing, the unauthorized research, and the personal cost Wallis paid to pursue an idea everyone else dismissed as impossible. One detail emerged that Wallis had never mentioned. He'd mortgaged his house in 1942 to pay for testing materials when his personal savings ran out. His wife Molly had signed the papers without asking questions. The mortgage wasn't paid off until 1949. Michael Summers, the assistant engineer who drowned during testing in 1941, has no memorial. His name appears on no monument. His death was recorded as an industrial accident, classified under the Official Secrets Act. His fiancée, Helen, never learned the full circumstances. She married another man in 1944 and moved to Canada in 1946. The Murner Dam was rebuilt by 1943, using forced labor from concentration camps. It still stands today, generating hydroelectric power for the Ruhr region. Near the dam wall, A small plaque commemorates the flood of May 17, 1943, listing the names of victims, primarily civilians and forced laborers who drowned in the valley below. What Barnes-Wallis proved was something military bureaucracies consistently resist, that genuine innovation often comes from individuals willing to work alone, risk their careers, and pursue solutions others dismiss as impossible. The bouncing bomb worked not because it was the most sophisticated weapon, but because one engineer refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. If this story moved you, hit that like button to help more people discover these forgotten moments of World War II. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of ordinary people who changed history in extraordinary ways. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and whether you'd heard of Barnes-Wallis before today. These stories survive only if people like you keep them alive. Thank you for being part of keeping this history from disappearing.